All right. Well, welcome everyone. We are delighted to have you with us today for a fascinating conversation with Maine's 21st century farmers. Thank you to everyone who is joining us live, and thank you to everyone who is watching this recording on YouTube. The 21st century has seen rapid changes in technology, in how we approach work, and in extreme weather patterns. We're now experiencing once in a century droughts and floods almost every year. And these changes are a challenge for all of us, but they are an existential challenge for our farmers. How are farmers adapting to these changes? Well, we are delighted to welcome two just absolute experts to help us answer that question. Sarah Simon is Maine Farmland Trust's Climate Resilience Specialist, and Melissa Law is both the co-owner of Bumbleroot Farm and the agriculture representative to the Maine Climate Council. Sarah and Melissa have done a ton of work together, and we are so excited and grateful to hear about that work and learn about what resilience to climate change looks like on the ground in Maine. So thank you for joining us. My name is Kathleen Meal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space for us to explore our environmental and social history, our policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. A few notes before we dive into today's program. We will hear from our speakers first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send those questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I will compile them, synthesize those with similar themes, and ask as many as possible following the presentations. We ask that you not message our speakers directly, as we want their focus on the presentation, not the chat box. If you have any technical challenges today, you can message Maggie Summers through the chat, and she will help you out. This event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on YouTube later this afternoon. You can find recordings of all of our previous programs there as well, and there are a number of playlists to help you focus in on the areas you're most interested in. Thank you again for joining us. And Sarah and Melissa, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us today. We're really excited to be here and excited to share what we've been working on with all of you. I'm going to just share our slides quickly. Great. Let me know if that is looking good to everybody. Okay, excellent to get the nods. So we're here today to talk with you about climate change and its impacts on agriculture, and using Melissa's farm, Bumbleroot Farm, as a case study for what her farm has done to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So in our talk today, we're going to cover first the big picture, how climate change relates to agriculture and what farms can do about it. And then Melissa will talk about her farm and the planning process that we went through. And then we'll close by talking a little bit about what's next, both for my work and for her work on the farm. So to begin, I'm just going to introduce myself and the organization I work for. I'm Sarah Simon. I'm the Climate Resilience Specialist for Maine Farmland Trust. And I came to this role as a vegetable farmer who saw a lot of other farmers in my age group struggling to establish farms and succeed. And one of the things that I've appreciated about Maine Farmland Trust is that it focuses on addressing farm viability holistically, but through the lens of land as the base and resource for all farming success. So we work statewide, and a lot of people are familiar with kind of the core of our work, which is purchasing and accepting donated conservation easements on farmland. But we also try to work beyond the conservation easement, recognizing that there are a lot of other factors that go into farm viability. And that's really where my work has emerged from. So our conservation easements are where we purchase the development rights to a farm, thereby ensuring that the land will remain open and available for agriculture. But in terms of thinking about how we can impact climate resilience on farms, we're trying to take that land protection mission one step further and find ways to support farmers so that the land isn't just available for agriculture, but the soils are kept healthy and viable for farming into the forever future, which is the duration of our conservation easements. So at this point, we have easements on over 350 farms, and we're just at the beginning of working with these farms in a slightly different way to include climate resilience planning into the services that we provide. So the way that I have started to do this as of 2 years ago, and this is how Melissa and I first started working together, was through the creation of a soil health network where I started working with 16 farms in our network with easements on their land to try and figure out what they needed to support the resilience of their farms to climate change. So all of these farms have been involved in on-farm research, helping them learn the impacts of their farm management practices on their soil health and the resilience of their farms. We've brought the farmers together for winter workshops and summer visits to each other's farms to learn from each other. And then each farm is working on a climate adaptation plan, which Melissa will talk about, that helps them chart out short, medium, and long-term strategies to build their farm's resilience. And then we provide seed funding for them to be able to take action on those plans. So this is how we started, with a pretty small group of farmers. And as I'll return to at the end of our talk, we're hoping to really expand the number of farms that we support in this way. So now, to get into the meat of our talk, I'm going to start with just a high-level overview of how climate change interacts with agriculture in general and in Maine specifically. And a lot of these images are from really our closest climate adaptation planning mentor, Rachel Chapman, who is a professor at University of Maine in her agroecology lab with the 2 graduate students that she's been working with. So we know that it's getting hotter, and that even though the weather this summer for us in Maine brought a lot of cooler days, on average, we're seeing an increase in temperatures and an increase in the length of the frost-free season in the Northeast. We also know that we're seeing increased variability in precipitation, and often periods of drought or periods of inundation, like we saw this summer with too much rain. But beyond the totals, also an increase in periods of very heavy precipitation. So really bad storms, which we also saw this summer, where all that water is coming down at once, which is much more challenging for farms to deal with. So the key takeaways of what's happening in the Northeast is that we're seeing increasing temperatures and greater extremes in precipitation. And for farms, those challenges mean that when it's wetter, it's much harder to go out and actually work the soil. And the farms are impacted by issues like compaction and lack of available nutrients associated with really wet conditions, and just not being able to get out and use machinery on their farms. Dry periods obviously are very challenging for crops as well. Farms are needing to invest in more irrigation to deal with those dry periods, and also developing new sources of water on the farm. And extreme heat has sort of obvious impacts for human health as well as for plants. A lot of plants aren't able to pollinate at higher temperatures, which can reduce yields, and they can also be stressed by the heat and potentially related drought. which leads to decreased yields of farm crops, and also the shifting dynamics of pests and diseases that may be able to survive increasingly mild winters and cause new problems for farmers. It's, as always, not clear that everything relating to climate change will pose a challenge. There may be some opportunities related to being able to grow different crops in Maine that previously wouldn't have been able to survive. But as always, the challenge of climate change is the uncertainty and how you plan for a future that involves drought and excess rainfall, potential benefits of the extended growing season, and the potential challenge of pests and disease. So this framework comes from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it describes their process of climate adaptation planning and kind of the conceptual framework that we've used in our work and that they suggest for how to tackle this uncertainty and arrive at action to build a farm's resilience. So at the very top, you have awareness, which is just learning both about the impacts of climate change and what farms can do. The next piece is the assessment piece, really understanding each individual farm and how it will be impacted. And that's happened both through the on-farm research that we've been able to support, also through a climate risk assessment tool that we're developing at Maine Farmland Trust, which I'll talk more about later, to help look at the particular risks posed by climate change on different farm properties. The planning piece has really been the meat of our work with these different farms. So helping each farm develop an individual plan that takes into account their risks and opportunities, getting to action, which is why the funding is so important to help farms immediately take action on what might otherwise feel like a really long-range plan. And then the final piece is ongoing monitoring, which again is where hopefully the on-farm research over time will help farms see the impacts of the different changes that they're making. So what are these practices? What can farms actually do? Well, Melissa's going to talk more about what she's specifically doing on her farm. But what I want to highlight here is this, the chart on the right that really shows the different ways that different practices can play a role for farms. So what I've mentioned so far has mainly focused on how farms have to adapt to climate change, but a lot of the same practices that will help a farm be more resilient in the face of excess rainfall or drought can also help the farm improve yields, because the same practices that build soil health to keep the soil in place during extreme rainfall also help improve yields and can also help sequester carbon, which is another way that farms can be part of a natural climate solution to climate change by sequestering carbon in the soil, as well as having to deal with the impacts. So this chart shows that there are practices that fall squarely into one or the other category, but then there's a sweet spot in the middle of some practices that really help farms accomplish all three different things. Some of those practices I've listed out on the left. There are different ways of managing soil and managing water on a farm. There's selecting different varieties of plants, different crops and breeds for different new climate realities, modifying the farm's landscape, moving roads, changing the location of fields to help the farm be less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, diversifying enterprises so that a year that is bad for one crop might still be viable for the farm overall if they have another crop that is more successful, investing in farm infrastructure, like the right machinery to do these different kinds of practices, or solar panels that make the farm more resilient in terms of its electricity production and less emissions intensive, building in financial risk management and business planning to make all of these decisions, and finally, the opportunity to reduce on-farm emissions because farms are big energy users. So before I turn over to Melissa, I just want to make sure to mention in the category of different practices that mitigate climate change, where farms have the opportunity to sequester carbon, I just want to give kind of a note of caution about the temptation to view farms as a natural climate solution. Farms certainly have the ability to sequester carbon. In Maine, the scale of farming that we have is simply not large enough to help offset all of the emissions we produce in the state. Some research from the University of Maine suggests that at most, farms might have the ability to offset all of their own farm emissions. So carbon sequestration on farms is a very good thing. My note of caution is that we should not be depending on farms in Maine to solve the climate crisis. Emissions reduction is really, I think, the most important strategy. And in Maine, carbon sequestration on forests is also where we're going to have the most bang for our buck when it comes to natural climate solutions. So it's really important to support farms as they adapt to all of these challenges. And for all of these different reasons, it can benefit their yields, but it's important not to put all of our hope in farms as the solution to climate change. So I will turn it over to Melissa now. She's going to talk about what some of these high-level changes and opportunities have looked like on her farm, and hopefully give you a tangible sense of what the planning process and the outcomes have looked like at Bumbleroot in Windham.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. That was a really great overview and introduction. So yeah, I'm going to dive into a little bit more of a case study of how we're experiencing changing weather patterns here at Bumbleroot, and how I've worked together with Sarah to create a climate adaptation plan for our farm. So my name is Melissa Law, and I'm a co-owner of Bumbleroot Organic Farm in Windham, Maine. I do want to acknowledge that the land we farm on was originally stewarded by the Abenaki people. And today we cultivate about 8 acres of an 89-acre parcel that is protected by an agricultural easement facilitated by Maine Farmland Trust. So we've worked together with Maine Farmland Trust in a number of ways over the past 10 years. We've really been able to build a great relationship through their different programming. So we grow certified organic vegetables and flowers, which we sell through 200 member CSA, a farm stand, and to restaurants, florists, and other wholesale accounts in the greater Portland area primarily. And so as we finish, next slide, Sarah, thanks. As we finish our 9th growing season at Bumbleroot, we're thinking about what the next decade will bring for our business and for the local food system here in Maine. We're already experiencing really significant extremes on our farm. Some years it's been really dry. Some years we've had a ton of rain, like this year. And so we're just trying to give a really close look at what is going to make our business sustainable, both from a financial perspective and with regards to stewarding the land and continuing to grow food for our communities. We view climate change as one of the greatest challenges our business will face in the years to come. And so we're seeking ways to mitigate and adapt, as Sarah outlined with one of the charts in her presentation, to these unpredictable weather patterns and events that have already begun to impact us. So what are the weather patterns that we're observing? I'm sure if anyone's paying attention to the weather or has your own garden, you've noticed that this summer was extremely wet. It was by far the wettest summer we've experienced on our farm. Rainfall was above average in June, July, and August, with close to 4 inches more rainfall in our town this July than in a typical year, according to the National Weather Service. We're also experiencing intensified storms. On August 8th, we measured 5 inches of rain on our farm in a 24-hour period. And just to give that a little context, we consider the 1 inch of rain that's expected this weekend to be a big rain event. So 5 inches was just an immense amount of rain to be falling on a harvest day with our entire crew out in the field. It was just a really extreme weather event for us. Additionally, we're noticing that frosts are less predictable than they were even 5 years ago. our average first frost dates in the fall. So that's what we plan for as the date that our crops will die, basically. Our usually comes between October 1st and October 10th on average. However, 2 years ago, we didn't have a killing frost until November, so almost a full month later than we had planned for and expected. And currently this year, there's no sign of frost in the 10-day forecast. So even though a lot of our crops are kind of slowing down because of the shorter day length, we haven't had a killing frost that really puts our season to an end, which can be a good thing, but it means that we need to really adapt our planning to planning for a later frost so that we can continue to harvest and produce longer into the fall. And so just generally these erratic frost dates and these changes between years of drought and really wet years make crop planning, budget projections, and planning for our seasonal labor needs difficult and uncertain. Next slide, please, Sarah. So it was just my awareness of these changing weather patterns that led me to participate in the Northeast Climate Adaptation Fellowship along with Sarah. Together, we spent time assessing the risks associated with these changing weather conditions here at Bumbleroot. And so we analyzed our land conditions, reflected on our farm practices, and then from there, we were able to identify what are really the biggest risks for our particular farm. And ultimately, we identified erosion as the biggest risk for our farm because our farm is located on a hill. And so we don't have a lot of tree cover. It was historically used as a dairy, so there's a lot of grazing land, and we've converted that into vegetable and flower production. And so our erosion is a factor from big rain events, from the high winds that we experience because we're at the top of a hill. There are a lot of different weather patterns that can lead to erosion. But really the land conditions are the foundation. So our soil types across the farm are primarily silt loam and sandy loam. And so in sandy loam soils, water drains very well, which can be good in these big rain events and in these wet years. But with the water drainage, the nutrients are also easily washed out of the soil. And so too much water can make fertility for vegetable production really challenging because it reduces crop yields and just can have a really damaging effect on our crops if we don't have enough nutrients in the soil. We also, as I mentioned, we also have 3 to 8% slopes across the farm, which adds to the erodibility of the fields. And then the dry periods that I've alluded to, followed by the intense storms, can cause flooding. High winds contribute to the erosion as well. And of course, the long wet season that we just experienced, we're definitely seeing our plants are experiencing more disease and susceptibility to pests just because they're already stressed by the water. And then a final set of factors that's important to note about how a farm is impacted by changing weather patterns is the farm practices that the farm uses. So, for example, we used to be a high tillage farm. We used to use a rototiller multiple times a season on one plot of land. But over the past 10 years, we've transitioned away from rototilling and towards reduced tillage and no-till practices because we've been learning about how tillage can have a huge impact on soil health. And another thing that can impact, another practice that can impact the health of the soils is, and lead to erosion, is leaving soils bare going into winter, which leads to a lot more runoff. And so as Sarah and I worked together to kind of assess the land conditions, the weather patterns, and the farm practices that we use here at Bumbleroot, we were then able to come up with a plan to make some changes to our practices that would help mitigate and adapt. So yeah, ultimately all of the factors that that I was talking about can lead to, Sarah mentioned some of these earlier, but can lead to topsoil loss, nutrient washout, increased disease pressure, decreased crop health and yields, flooding, and the potential for waterway pollution with nutrient runoff from fertilizer use. So, all right, so now I'll move on to climate adaptation planning and what our planning process looked like. During our climate adaptation fellowship, we were tasked with coming up with short-term, medium-term, and long-term strategies for adapting to climate change. So I'm going to just give you a few examples of the strategies that we came up with to improve our practices or build resilience on our farm. For short-term strategies, as I mentioned, we're really experimenting with reducing tillage. Having identified erosion as the primary risk for our farm, we're really focused on increasing soil coverage and improving soil health. So it means we're no longer using tractors in some of our fields, and we're using a deep mulch compost system to suppress weeds and add more organic matter to the soil. We also have been more focused on cover crop planning, so that reduces the amount of bare soils on the farm that are susceptible to erosion. So these photos that you see here are examples of our no-till permanent bed system. So we never use tractors in these fields anymore. And then the photo on the right is a stand of cover crop, so that we aren't leaving soils bare going into winter. And then for medium-term strategies, we decided to focus on integrating more perennials into our traditional row crop system. And so here you'll see a bed of newly planted elderberry bushes and perennial herbs in between annual carrot and onion crops. And so the goal here is to provide more permanent root mass in our fields to help slow water as it is moving down slopes, and also to create biodiversity, pollinator habitat for beneficial insects. We were really fortunate to receive funding from the Natural Resources Conservation Services to plant hedgerows as wind barriers. So we planted 9 different species in a 1,000-foot hedgerow to help shield the top of our hill from wind. Obviously, it's not, we just planted it 2 years ago, so it's not fully functioning yet, but it's going to hopefully provide some protection for our fields in years to come. And we were also granted funding for a 1/2-acre pollinator meadow to support increased biodiversity of the pollinator species here at Bumbleroot. And then for long-term strategies, we set the intention to transition as much as possible to renewable energy on our farm. And so we installed solar panels on our barn in 2021 and purchased an electric delivery van with the goal of reducing our carbon footprint and our reliance on fossil fuels. So now when we're doing deliveries around the greater Portland area, we're doing it with an electric vehicle. And that just is in line with our goals overall to be a more sustainable business and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. So what's next for Bumbleroot? To circle back to my original question about what we envision for the next 10 years. we plan to expand our no-till system, which has proven to be very effective in wet years like this year in terms of crop yields and erosion reduction. We're continuing to integrate perennials both within our annual fields and on a larger scale around the farm. So this slide shows a recently completed ecological design project, which focuses on planting trees for fruit production, shade, and the benefit of carbon sequestration. And so hopefully more trees and more perennials across the farm will help us to mitigate climate risks moving forward. And also ideally produce crops that we can sell to our community. So yes, that was a lot. Thank you for listening. And now I will pass it back to Sarah to close our presentation.
Great. So in terms of what is next for Maine Farmland Trust, we are hoping to work with more farms on this kind of planning process. I think Melissa and her business partners came in with a lot of these great ideas, and it was really just a process of getting them organized and into a timeline and structure so that they felt they could turn these long range hopes into something more immediate that they could take action on. I think a lot of farms are in a position where they can do that. There are certainly more farms who aren't even yet thinking about the long-term horizon. And so we really want to expand our planning efforts to work with more of the farms that we're connected with and help support them. We want to be a conduit for more funding for these kinds of projects. So a lot of what Melissa mentioned may have indirect benefits on their farm yields and their profits, but a lot of it may not, at least not in the short term. And so it's really important to provide funding to help support farmers who want to do things like this. And then we want to keep adding to our skill set on staff to help farmers with these kinds of designs and plans for the farms, and develop more partnerships to bring in public funding and resources for farmers. So I'll just give one example of something exciting we're working on right now, which is a map-based tool to let farmers and Maine MFT's land protection staff assess the climate risks on each farm. So this tool, which will launch in hopefully the next month or so, will allow people to look up a farm property and to see what the rainfall projections of how rainfall, for example, will change on that property look like as compared to other properties across the state. They'll also let users look at the availability of water sources on the property, what kind of aquifer the farm is on, and will compile all that information into an overall climate risk score. So this will hopefully allow people, as they're thinking about moving on to land or assessing different properties, or just want to know more about the farm they already own, to get a better sense of the specific ways that climate change will impact that property. And then, as I mentioned, we're really hoping to bring in a lot more funding to the state. And fortunately, there's a lot of public funding for climate smart agriculture out there. So we're a part of two big US Department of Agriculture grants called the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. We'll be able to start enrolling growers probably next year and providing an average size of $15,000 grants to farmers for climate smart projects on their farm, as well as doing more of these kinds of plans with farmers in our network. And then we're fortunate to have secured private funding as well, which will let us be a lot more flexible and responsive to farmers as immediate needs pop up, like, for example, all the rainfall this season that caused drainage problems for a lot of people. We want to work better with the Natural Resource Conservation Service that Melissa mentioned, which is really the main provider of conservation funding for farms nationally. And one way that we're doing that is by developing a new partnership position, which will hopefully be posted later this fall or winter. That will be a shared staff role to work with farmers on their climate adaptation planning, as well as getting more farmers enrolled into those programs. Given that enrollment into any government program takes time, however, it's really fortunate that we also have some private funding so that we can meet more immediate needs for farms. So in short, there's a lot more funding coming to Maine soon through us and also other partners on this slide on the list. And I think it's a really exciting time to start really investing in farms so that they can be resilient to all of the different challenges posed by climate change. So we'll wrap up there and are very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much, Melissa. When we reached out and started talking about this program, you guys said, "Oh, we have got a lot to share," and you were right. So thank you. For everyone who's on today, just a reminder, you will get a follow-up email later this afternoon with the link to this recording and some other links that will help you continue your learning and take some action. So you'll find links to help you find and support your local farm. You should definitely check out Bumbleroot Farm and consider signing up for the fall CSA, which is available now. You will find links to help you learn more about Maine Farmland Trust, including to sign up for their newsletter. Definitely keep an eye out for the annual meeting coming up in December. And you'll also find some ways to encourage elected officials to support more funding for those incredible programs that Sarah and Melissa walked us through. We've got some really great questions to get started with. And if you have any others as you are listening, drop them in the chat and we'll dig in. So first off, Sarah and Melissa, I love the idea of this fellowship and the way that you connected through that. Is that the norm, or are most farmers in Maine sort of navigating these risk farmer factors and innovating their farm practices on their own? What kind of network is there to share this incredible learning?
Well, I can tell you my impression, and then I think Melissa should weigh in too from her experience. I think Maine benefits from having a lot of really strong farm networks and farm-focused organizations. Certainly, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association has a really great network of farmers that have come through their Journey Person program, which is sort of like an incubator for new farm businesses and a lot of people who remain connected. I think what is tricky is that farmers are so busy that having the structure of something like the fellowship and kind of the accountability of staying in touch with someone who is providing a service to the farm in the long haul, I think that's something that I feel is a little bit harder to achieve. So, UMaine Extension is the go-to for any sort of pest or disease question, but this kind of holistic long-range planning process is really something I think a little bit more unique that we got to experience through the fellowship. And it may not be something that every farmer, necessarily wants or benefits from, but I feel like it's really helpful to have someone who's in it for the long haul with the farm. At this point, Melissa and I have been in touch for, I guess, over 2 years, and I've been able to go back so frequently to see how things are changing. And I think that kind of sustained relationship to me seems like something that's really important for all farms because it's such hard work. It's valued by the community, and yet farmers are often on their own in the field day to day. And I think that can feel isolating. And at least it did for me sometimes when I was a farmer. And so it's really important to have more and more long-term relationships. And there's a lot of that in Maine, but I think there can always be more. But I'm curious how that feels for Melissa.
Yeah, no, I think you said it very eloquently, Sarah. I definitely agree that Maine is unique in that there is so much support for farmers through MAFCA and Maine Farmland Trust, and a really strong cooperative extension network across the state. And I know that we have benefited from so many programs, from the Journey Person program that Sarah mentioned to a farm business planning program that Maine Farmland Trust offers. And I know that there's a program called Farms for the Future that other farmer colleagues of mine have participated in. And not only that, but farming does require a lot of infrastructure. And so starting a farm can be really challenging just because of the cost, just like starting any business. It requires a lot of upfront cost. And so there are some great options here in Maine for finding financing that is a little more flexible than a traditional lender. So we've worked closely with CEI, and I know that there are other. Maine Harvest Credit Union is supporting farmers in Maine. So yeah, I think that we just live in a state that's super supportive of farmers, and we as a business have definitely benefited from that.
That is so good to hear. And thanks for the shout out to CEI. We have a few folks from CEI on the call today, and I really appreciate that reminder that the kind of financing that is available, it's not just about the dollars, right? It's about the whole structure and the way that you approach the challenges. So it's really exciting to think about this work happening in partnership in Maine, and of course makes me wonder, is that what it's like in the rest of the country, or are there, our crops and everything is different? And Sarah, you're shaking your head, so I'll stop talking and let you say more.
Yeah, I think Maine is really unique. And when I was farming, I was in the Hudson Valley in New York, which is also an agricultural region, a place that I thought was going to have a lot of infrastructure, having I started farming in Maine and then went to the Hudson Valley. And I expected, that there would be events and workshops every week on farms because that's what happens in Maine. And there weren't. And I think that other parts of the country have their own networks, of course, and, places that have more of a sort of conventional agricultural economy that's more focused around the production of commodity crops have groups that lobby for them. And I think there are different support networks, but I think Maine is very unique in terms of the scale of the opportunities and the focus on helping people get onto land and build up a farm business, because I think a lot of other places have networks that support established farms. But I think what Maine is unique in doing is really the emphasis on trying to help people develop smaller farms, diversified farms, and the local food economy. So I think it's quite unique, and we're fortunate here to have those kinds of opportunities.
Know us. And at the same time, that means we're operating in a really different ecosystem than farmers in other parts of the country. And I wonder what that means for some of the state resources are obviously going to be tailored to us, but how about federal resources and programs? What's the how do those line up with the way farms actually work in Maine versus other parts of the country? I'm thinking about the Farm Bill in particular, but because that's that huge piece of legislation that really anything connected to food falls under at the federal level. Does it work for Maine?
I'll say.
Oh, sorry.
No, you go,
I'll start, and then Sarah. I know that Sarah will definitely have more to add, but I think that the Farm Bill can have a really prominent impact on smaller, more diversified farms like Bumbleroot and other farms here in Maine, because there's definitely funding within the Farm Bill that's allocated specifically to small farms. For example, we've benefited from multiple NRCS programs like the EQIP program, which is funded through the Farm Bill, to build high tunnels, which are big greenhouses where we grow crops directly in the ground. And so that has really helped us in terms of season extension. We can grow greens in those tunnels year round. And so that has also built resilience to these changing weather patterns because we plant our highest value crops in those tunnels in the summer months. And so if we do have a hailstorm or a serious rain event or wind event, they're protected. And I know that I've participated in lobbying with the National Young Farmers Coalition, which is a national coalition of different regional groups of young farmers, so farmers that have been farming for less than 10 years, and that group is advocating for the needs of young farmers who are experiencing challenges with accessing land. That's a huge issue for young farmers. And so there's funding that's coming from the Farm Bill to increase land access and help with student loan debt so that can contribute to farm viability. So yeah, I think that that big federal funding packages can have a direct impact on small farms. And we're really fortunate to have Representative Shelley Pingree, who is a farmer herself, working for us at the national level. She's really involved in advocating for small farms, and yeah, we've benefited a lot from her voice.
Sarah, go ahead.
I was just going to add, and I think it's good that Melissa went first because there are a lot of great programs that really benefit farms. I was going to add that I think I do see some programs that get underutilized or not utilized as effectively in Maine as in other places, which has to do, as you mentioned, with just the type of farming happening here. So one example is the Conservation Stewardship Program, which is known by CSP. All these Farm Bill programs have their own acronym. And that's a program that Melissa and her business partners did end up enrolling in, but it's not widely utilized in Maine. And I think that's because this is a program that compensates farmers for both practices they're already doing, as well as new practices that they want to begin. And that's different from most of the other programs administered by the Natural Resource Conservation Service. It's really beneficial because, in Bumbleroot's case, they could receive some compensation for a lot of the good work they were already doing, like their no-till practices. I think the reason it's underutilized in the Northeast often is that the farms are small, and since the payments are per acre, they end up being lower than they would be in other parts of the country, which makes sense, but it just means that then farmers in the Northeast aren't benefiting as much from some of NRCS's more innovative programs, not to mention different programs like crop insurance that, again, have a similar barrier for smaller and more diversified farms. So I think there's a lot of good federal funding flowing to Maine, and sometimes the challenge is just connecting it directly to farmers. And part of that issue is also staff capacity at the NRCS offices in Maine. I know that they are trying to hire now with money from the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's been very hard to build up staff. And that's part of why we're hopeful that our partnership position, which of course we'll have to hire for too, might be challenging, but hopefully that will help to add to staff capacity to get more federal funding out the door. Because I think at this point, my understanding from NRCS is that it's a sort of bottleneck situation where there will hopefully be a lot of money coming in for farms from the Inflation Reduction Act, but they need the staff to get it out the door. And so they're going to have to staff up quickly. So if anyone on the call knows someone with an interest in soil science and farming and a love of government bureaucracy, they should point them to NRCS. They are definitely looking to hire at the moment.
I love that. And I also this is the second conversation I've had this morning about the staff capacity issue. We've done so much to pass really important policies to make sure that the right funding is allocated, but you need people to connect one to the other and all of those to farmers, and that's true. It's true for farmers. It's true for lots of other programs as well. And so it's just part of that environment that we're working in. Okay, so that's on the government side and the bureaucracy side. what about consumers? The great thing when we get to talk about Maine farms is that we are all benefiting from the climate resilience pieces, all of that, but we also benefit from some really delicious locally grown food. What can we do as consumers to support, to understand the challenges that you all are facing and to support the kinds of practices that benefit us all short term? I liked that chart that you had, Melissa, of like what's happening now, what's happening in the next couple of years, and what's the long-term viability.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really touch on this in my presentation, but I believe strongly that as climate change rears its head, we will start to see more and more supply chain issues, and the breadbasket of the United States out in California is seeing wildfires and extreme heat and storms, and so it's going to be more and more important for the local food economy to be able to feed Maine. I think a few years ago, Maine consumers were only 10% of the food consumed in Maine was grown in Maine. I know that the Maine Climate Action Plan set a target to increase that number to 30% of the food consumed in Maine grown in Maine. And so I think what consumers can do is buy local food. There are really amazing farms in every industry. There are great dairy farms. There are great farms that are producing grains and meat and vegetables and flowers. And so I think that what the consumer can do is just buy local food. Go to your local farmers market, join a CSA, go to the farm stand down the road. And if farms get that support from their community, then we'll be able to stay in business so that 10 and 20 years down the line, when the rest of the country is also experiencing climate change in a very serious way, we'll be able to grow the food that people around here need.
And I just want to add to understand that when you shop locally, of course, you're paying more. And I think probably this is a group of informed consumers here, but I would understand that price increase as in part farm practices and paying for sustainable practices, but really the bulk of it is labor, and recognizing that when you shop locally, the food is grown by people who are your neighbors and live in Maine and experience the same cost of living. And when you're buying cheaper food at the grocery store, people are not getting paid the same kinds of wages in the places where that food is being grown. And so I think it's really important to understand that the prices farms charge are really to be able to try to pay their employees as fairly as possible. And even so, it's, especially with inflation, really hard to keep up with that. So please, try to see the prices in that light and realize that you're really paying for people in your community to have the ability to grow food and lead good, hopefully middle-class lives. And that's a really important part of what also makes the local food economy sustainable.
Really appreciate that reminder, and all of those things are true before we even begin to account for the vehicle miles traveled of bringing food from far away as opposed to right down the road. So thank you. I really appreciate that. And Melissa, you mentioned the work of the Maine Climate Council. What else is on your to-do list for the next round? I know this time last week we were at the Augusta Civic Center kicking off the next round of the Climate Council process. What's at the top of your list for this next climate action plan?
Yeah, honestly, I really think that increasing the food that's consumed in Maine, that's grown in Maine, is really something that I believe really strongly in and that I'm really passionate about. And yeah, I'm excited to see what the Natural and Working Lands Working Group can come up with in terms of targets for preserving farmland, conserving farmland, because as I mentioned, access to farmland is one of the biggest hurdles for young and beginning farmers, because so much of the prime agricultural soils are also highly desired by developers, and so farmland is just getting eaten up really fast. And so I think preserving farmland so that we can continue to grow food into the future is definitely high on should be high on the priority list.
We will also include, we're going to send you just the best list of things to look at and follow up on after this program. And one of them will be a link to the Climate Council work, because Melissa mentioned the Natural and Working Lands Working Group. Those meetings will be public. So there's a core group of people who are serving on that working group, including Melissa. Thank you very much. And then there'll be opportunities to join those meetings, whether they're happening on Zoom or in person or hybrid. But we'll share the information so you can get on the email list, know when those meetings are happening, and what you can do to pay attention and stay involved. We could go for the rest of the day. I say this every week, but it's always true. We have so many great questions that we haven't even gotten a chance to scratch the surface of. My last question for you two, Sarah and Melissa, is if we have young farmers who reach out, or experienced farmers who reach out after this program and say, wow, that stuff was cool, how can I get involved? What should we tell them?
Well, they should definitely connect with me and send me an email, because we're getting ready, as I mentioned, to launch a lot more funding and planning opportunities to work with us and get funding for your climate smart projects. So definitely reach out.
Terrific. Expect to see a little lunch and learn bump in your email traffic.
Yeah,
Thank
I would
you.
just I
Oh,
would
go ahead.
add I would just add that MOFGA, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, is also a really great resource for new farmers. They have lots of workshops and mentorship programs and apprenticeship programs. So that's a great place to look if you're starting out.
It is so encouraging to hear that Maine really is the way farming and farm collaboration should be. So thank you very much. We are so grateful to Sarah Simon from Maine Farmland Trust, Melissa Law from Bumbleroot Farm, and to all of you for joining us today. We will be back in this space next week, exploring a very different landscape. We're going to the Arctic. Come with us. Dr. Susanna Hatch, who is a polar explorer with the UN, is going to be with us to tell us about her adventures and the work she's done with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Hope to see you then. Have a terrific weekend and eat lots of delicious local food. Thank you.